Good morning. On behalf of our sponsors, Call to Action, Catholics for Choice, and Corpus, we warmly welcome you. My name is Linda Pinto, and I am with Corpus, which originally stood for the Corps of Resigned Priests United for Service, priests who wish to remain in active institutional ministry, but also marry. Years later, we were renamed Corpus, the National Association for a Married Priesthood, priests willing to return to active institutional ministry as long as their wives and families were cherished and celebrated. And finally, Corpus, the National Association for an Inclusive Priesthood, priests who would never return to active institutional service unless the priesthood was open to all, men and women, married and single, gay and straight, a priesthood open to all who answer God's call to servant leadership. You see, it's true. Ecclesia semper reformandum est. Loosely translated, the church always changes. I have also served as a facilitator of CORE, Catholic Organizations for Renewal, a consortium of over 20 progressive Catholic organizations, many of whom are here at this forum co-sponsoring it. We trust you will enjoy this day-long event, which will hopefully enlighten and inspire you to continue to address what is Francis's glaring blind spot. You well know that Chicago enjoys a long history of women whose voices echo a call for dignity and equality. Jane Addams was a pioneer American settlement social worker, public philosopher, sociologist, author, and leader in the women's suffrage movement. In an era when presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson identified themselves as social activists, Addams outshined them as one of the most prominent reformers of the progressive era. Ida B. Wells was an African-American journalist and newspaper editor, a sociologist and early leader in the women's as well as the civil rights movement. Notably and disturbingly, she courageously documented lynching in the United States, showing that it was often used as a way to control or punish blacks who competed with whites. Frances Xavier Cabrini was an Italian nun who founded the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart, serving the immigrant Italian population in Chicago. Despite the lack of support by bishops and clergy alike, her groundbreaking outreach to the poor and marginalized earned her the privilege of being the first naturalized citizen in the United States to be canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. Feminist prophets include Tina Fey, Jennifer Hudson, and Chaka Khan. And I would be remiss not to invoke the names of the Holy Trinity of contemporary Chicago women saints, Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, and Oprah Winfrey. So today we focus on Francis, whom I call my holy conundrum. His words indeed are impressive. Listen to what he says. The best wines come from every person who risks everything on love. Things have a price and can be for sale, but people have a dignity which is priceless. Let the church always be a place of mercy and hope, where everyone is welcomed, loved, and forgiven. It is vital that government leaders and financial leaders take heed and broaden their horizons, working to make sure that all citizens have dignified work, education, and health care. And finally, let us not be afraid to say it. We want change, real change, structural change. We want change in our lives, in our neighborhoods, in our everyday reality. We want a change which can affect the entire world, since global interdependence calls for global answers to local problems. The globalization of hope, a hope which springs up from peoples and takes root among the poor, must replace the globalization of exclusion and indifference. makes one wonder. Does Francis truly intend to inspire the church to become the open window of John the 23rd, letting in the fresh air of the Spirit? Or does he represent an institutional dose of air freshener, hoping we could smell the roses rather than the stench of a clerical system which at best isolates women and at worst renders them invisible? We need a tectonic shift. Angela Merkel is widely recognized as one of the most powerful women in the world. Yet my Catholic granddaughters continually encounter the barriers of women need not apply from all ministries, which include assisting the priest at the altar or being the priest at the altar. Malala Yousafzai conquered violence and poverty to champion the cause of women's equal access to education, while at the same time, female Catholic school teachers are dismissed without due process if found to have purchased contraceptives, attempted pregnancy through in vitro fertilization, or even voiced support for marriage equality or women's ordination. The Vatican has enthusiastically opened its doors to staunch evangelical spokespersons such as Rich Warren and Joel Osteen and David Green, co-owner of Hobby Lobby, but its doors are closed to contemporary prophets such as Joan Chittister, Elizabeth Johnson, and our own Janine Gramick. Taylor Swift can bring a huge corporation like Apple to its knees, but praying, paying, and obeying is where the Catholic hierarchy believes is the rightful place for women. So one wonders. On his most recent trip through South America, Francis astonished the world by apologizing for the sins against the indigenous peoples by the church. Women will not wait another 500 years to hear these words of enlightenment and apology. The time is now. It is said the best examples of social progress are always those who are themselves a living testament to the change they wish to make. That is you and I together. So let us begin. Our first panel is entitled Always at the Center, but Never at the Front, the Role of Women in the Church, and it will be moderated by Deb Rose Malovic, Executive Director of Future Church.
Well, thank you, Linda, and good morning, everybody. As Linda said, my name is Deb Rose Milovic, and I'm the Executive Director of Future Church. Future Church is celebrating its 25th year of existence this year, and we have in the audience Sister Chris Schenk, the brilliant woman co-founder who has brought this organization to where it is today. Future Church is a coalition of Catholics working to provide opportunities for all the baptized, including women, to participate fully in the life and leadership of the church. Bringing women into full and equal partnership in all aspects of church life, governance, and ministry is a central feature of our work. Thank you. As we begin this panel, always at the center, but never at the front, the role of women in the church, I ask, where are the women? How are the women? As Pope Francis makes his inaugural visit to the United States this September, as we approach the final phase of the Synod on the Family, as we enter into the Jubilee Year of Mercy, how will women fare? Will our voices be heard? Will our gifts, our intellect, our skills be engaged? Will our concerns and insights show up in any official policy, any pastoral directives? Will the bishops read Catholic Women Speak? I have to show it. A brand new resource edited by Tina Beatty, written essays by women who are addressing the topics that will be addressed at the Synod on the Family. It's a fabulous resource by Paulus Press. Make sure you get a copy. Will we see ourselves more clearly in our liturgies, in the language we share when we come together for worship, in our prayers? Just look at the prayer for the Jubilee Year of Mercy, where Magdalene is again paired with the adulteress. We have a lot of work to do. Where are the women, and how are the women? We know women are leading throughout the Catholic world. We know the Pat Farrells, the Carolyn Woos, the Donna Markhams, and so many others. The church would be nothing without the dedication of women. Still, women have yet to write one encyclical, one apostolic letter or exhortation, and when it comes to official church teaching, women are the recipients, the distribution centers, not the engineers. In choosing our leadership, women cast no votes. We do not determine who should be pope or who should head curial offices. Bishops and priests are not chosen by women or even vetted by them. The system is rigged. We know it. It is shaped by patriarchy, misogyny, ignorance, and yes, I would say sin. We need a way forward. We need a way in, and that's why we're here today. We begin this panel with Gina Messina Dysart and William David Myers. Gina is Dean of the School of Graduate and Professional Studies at Ursuline College. She is co-founder of Feminism and Religion. She is the author of Rape, Culture, and Spiritual Violence, and the co-editor of Feminism and Religion in the 21st Century, and a brand new book coming out, Faithfully Feminist, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Feminists on Why We Stay. Gina has presented across the United States at universities, conferences, and in the national news, including the Tavis Smiley Show, one of my favorites, the MSNBC. Gina also took to the TEDx stage in 2014 to give her talk, The New Feminist Revolution in Religion. She has spoken at the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations and is active in movements to end gender-based violence. You can follow her on Twitter at FemTheologian and on her website at GinaMessinaDysart.com. William David Myers is a professor of history at Fordham University. He specializes in the religious history of early modern Europe and the legal and social history of crime and gender in 16th and 17th century Germany. He has published 2 books, Poor Sinning Folk, Confession and Conscience in Counter-Reformation Germany, and Death and a Maiden, Infanticide and the Tragical History of Greta Schmidt. The movie rights have been purchased by Utopia Productions in Germany. In addition to numerous articles written on the history of penance and confession in European history, David has written for Conscience on the subject of the papacy in the modern world and women in the Catholic Church. He has also been a frequent reviewer for the Chicago Tribune. Currently, he is completing 2 books, American Torture and the Western Experience, and Sin and Penance in the History of Christianity. So welcome to you both. So here's how this panel is going to go. David will begin by taking us through the sweep of history of women's roles in leadership in the church, and Gina's going to follow by discussing women's contemporary experience in the church. After they both present, we'll have a time of Q&A for all of you. So let's begin, and I invite David to the podium.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Linda, and thanks to all of you. I have to preface this by saying Buen Camino to all of my students at Fordham. Today is the Feast of Santiago, July 25th, and I'm hoping at least one of my students managed to wake up this morning to watch from New York. The history of women and Catholicism is long and tangled. involving dazzling, beautiful myths based on female sanctity and sacrifice, set against a more depressing, mundane reality rooted in exploitative labor and exclusion from power. The church is not simply a spiritual assembly. It is an organization and an institution, dependent on work at the center, power and finance at the front. And here the evidence shows clearly that, except at Christianity's very beginning, and only intermittently since, women have done at least half of Roman Catholicism's work, culturally and physically. But this work has brought neither structural, nor financial, nor intellectual authority in the modern church. The contrast between devotion and power explains much of the historical tension in Catholic life and culture, a fact already evident in the New Testament. Women were among the first and most persistent disciples of Jesus, the last to remain at the cross and the very first to witness the resurrection. St. Paul's letters repeatedly greet active women, while at other times admonishing them to silence and duty, even forbidding them to preach. In the culture of early Christianity, women as owners and managers of houses where Christians met were active in fostering, guiding, and financing the community. This is not to say that the early church was any kind of golden age for gender equality in Christianity. But at least at the beginning, there was room for women, not just at the center, but often at the front. When in the 2nd century the hierarchy began to differentiate into clerical offices holding sacramental powers, bishop, deacon, priest, women's roles in the emerging power structure diminished considerably. The early church was full of heroic women martyrs and virgins whose extraordinary physical and moral sufferings witnessed to Christian truth. As male-led Christian institutions grew more powerful, women's authority came to reside in their willingness to sacrifice themselves, first as virgin martyrs, then as virgins. In Mary, the mother of Jesus, churchmen described a woman whose strength and piety placed her at the center of the church, but whose power came from resigning herself to God's will and remaining far from the front, distinguishing her from that other woman, the Magdalene, now always presented as the repentant, converted penitent. The pattern then for later years was already set by the end of the 4th century. Christian men would deliberate and rule at the front, and Christian women would suffer and obey, usually in silence, but always at the center, their spiritual and cultural work to display the blessedness of purity and the spiritual value of humility. For women in medieval and early modern Christianity, this pattern became the norm. By the 13th century, intellectual authority lay in the hands of universities and trained theologians serving an exclusively male hierarchy. While it would have been unheard of socially for a woman to earn a doctorate, another development would also work to her exclusion, then and now. University theological faculties, many run by the new mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, increasingly required priests and ordination as the keys to intellectual and academic authority. In an age of suppressing heresy and exacting conformity, the church would not entrust doctrine to those it could not directly control. Excluded from power, women found themselves outside the boundaries of learning as well. The resulting misogyny may or may not be intrinsic to Christianity, on which I think, frankly, the jury is still out. But in an institution organized around exclusively male power, it was inevitable, eventually entrenched, and frequently celebrated. Even so, women did assert themselves and push gently to the front of pastoral care and education, sometimes not so gently. As men established monasteries or became mendicants, women also organized into convents and other unofficial associations, such as the Beguines, for prayer and for service, working outside the convent. Just as quickly, though, the Latin Church sought to push them back. Enclosure, already common in Eastern Christianity, became officially a requirement for all women religious, first in the Statute Periculoso of 1298. And by the mid-16th century, the Council of Trent banned all works of women's charity that seemed incompatible with enclosure. Henceforth, women's official religious orders had to preoccupy themselves with the education of young girls, a task for which the Ursulines became and remain famous. Even here, though, devout women found a means to organize and to act publicly in a meaningful way of their choosing. Frequently, this meant using mystical experiences to overcome official obstacles, as in the case of Teresa of Avila. Whatever the official position of the Church on claustration, the importance of women's ministries to function and identity eventually forced ecclesiastics into some form of accommodation. Whether in or out of the cloister, women forged other paths through and around the official strictures of religious life. In 1633, for example, Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac founded the Daughters of Charity. Members took and renewed their vows annually rather than take solemn lifetime vows. Doing so allowed the order to avoid the strictures of the cloister, while the name daughters distanced them from more traditional nuns or sisters. In the 19th century, John Carroll and Elizabeth Ann Seton founded a similar order, the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph. But these women took solemn vows, though they worked outside the cloister. The success of the Daughters of Charity made clear just how necessary women active in the world were to the Church's mission. And so by the end of the 18th century, the papacy was backing away from strict demands for claustration. Claustration is such a great word. It says just about everything you need to know, really, about women in the Church, unfortunately. For professionally religious women in America, it was in the 19th and 20th centuries that the indispensability of women's religious work became apparent. Whether caring for orphans in Philadelphia, such as my mother, working among the poor in Chicago, or teaching school children in my hometown of El Paso, Texas, the service of women religious provided the backbone of Catholic infrastructure in the United States. Simply put, there would be no widespread Catholic education or catechism in America without the presence of women religious. And yet, though nuns were in the classroom, leading parish education, working tirelessly among the poor, and even earning advanced degrees, their authority depended on the goodwill of male bishops and priests. The sister who spent her year teaching second graders their catechism had to defer when Father decided to visit for a day to test them. And for all their work, effort, and education, nuns were absent from the altar while priests administered the sacraments, the center of religious and sacral power in Catholicism. I can remember to this day the name of the nun who made me practice my first confession right down to the sins, walked me through my first communion, strengthened my Catholic boy issue clip-on bow tie. That was Sister Mary O'Brien. The priest who heard the official confession, consecrated the host, placed it on my now, and the only time in my life, worthy tongue, I can't remember. His name is lost to eternity. In the aftermath of Vatican II's call for Catholics to work in the world for justice and the poor, religious women answered yet again in a veritable explosion of new roles, from protesting the war to working for the rights of immigrants. It is at this historical point that the paradox of religious women in the Church became most apparent. Women were working everywhere, earning professional and academic degrees across the board, including in sacred theology. Recognition, though, might come in the form of censure and backlash against the increased visibility and prominence of women in Catholicism, the desire to be at the altar, even as an acolyte, Eucharistic minister, or the desire to be a theological ethicist teaching at one of America's premier divinity schools. So it was that in 2009, the Church launched an investigation of some 340 congregations of women, and in particular, a doctrinal assessment of the Leadership Conference of Catholic Women Religious, which represents a high percentage of America's 57,000 nuns. Now, following Vatican II's brief promise and the subsequent retrenchment, a new pope has made casual remarks that suggest a relatively enhanced appreciation of women's work in the Church. The apostolic visitation, begun in 2009, has ended on a conciliatory note. American Catholic women, hungry for any positive sign, have responded with hope and enthusiasm. At the same time, with a hierarchy mostly appointed by two previous popes whose empathy for women's roles and their plight was limited, to say the least, it is difficult to imagine any sudden transformations in the relations of women in the Church. And no matter how progressive in comparison with his predecessors, Pope Francis has already expressed his nervousness about how a new approach to the, quote, role of women is often inspired by the ideology of machismo, unquote, at odds with the fact that, quote, a woman has a different makeup than a man, unquote. And as the Pope launches a grand vision of social reform, totally welcome, we must be aware that Catholic calls to social justice in the modern world, the preferential option for the poor, have traditionally offered an essentially conservative view of the family and of women's role. Everyone has been down this road before. The situation, though, comes at a perilous point for women in religious orders, whose numbers have dwindled from 125,000 to 180,000 in the 1960s to 57,000 today, with a median age approaching 70. Some commenters have sought to dismiss this collapse by noting that the mid-1960s represented an anomalous high point. The number of Roman Catholic religious in 1900 has been pegged at 55,000, so the numbers are not that different. Alas, in 1900, the American population was 76 million. Today, it is 310 million. And Catholics in 1900 numbered 12 million, 16% of the American population. Today, there are 69 million nominal American Catholics, accounting for 22% of the whole. In other words, in 1900, there was one woman religious for every 218 American Catholics. Today, there is one woman religious for every 1,200 American Catholics. And, not to be too pessimistic, one priest for every 1,815 American Catholics. For women religious, then, the institutional church confronts a daunting task. It has not allowed them to the front and may soon find them gone even from the center. It might be tempting to distinguish at some point between women committed to the church as a professional vocation and those whose lives focused on worldly matters, such as family and reproduction. Surprisingly, though, well, actually not surprising, medieval and modern Catholicism have had little room for them, intellectually or even practically. For devout Catholic laywomen in the Latin West, marriage and childbearing clashed awkwardly with the eternal demand for chastity. What resulted in medieval Catholicism was a double standard in which committed virgins were, in theory, esteemed over their secular counterparts. In the emerging ideology, a woman's body, no matter how chaste and honored for its offspring, was contaminated. For pious married women, sexuality was not a gift to be celebrated, but a curse to be borne. Offspring the penalty. Even the ever-virgin Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven, was wedded to earthly Joseph as a sign of submission to God's will, that she bear and raise a child, while her true spouse was a spiritual one. Unfortunate women who bore children outside wedlock in Catholic lands were outcasts, often forced to abandon their newborns to orphanages. In Ireland, the United States, and other English-speaking countries, the Magdalen Asylums incarcerated supposedly wayward women in workhouses. Though not exclusively Catholic, in Ireland and elsewhere, the Magdalen laundries were run by nuns and supported by the state. Lest we think of these as belonging to a dark and distant past, we should remember that the last such asylum closed in 1996, less than 20 years ago. The Church in recent decades has sought contortedly to affirm reproductive women in their bodies, but its contortions may no longer matter. In Europe and the United States, women have bluntly refused to submit to the Church's judgment on matters of sexuality and reproduction. Humanae Vitae was greeted by mass abandonment of confession and priestly guidance, and pastoral care has never recovered. A 2014 poll conducted by the Spanish-language network Univision found that 78% of Catholics worldwide are untroubled by contraception, while other recent surveys have found that 82% of American Catholics find contraception morally acceptable, and 63% continue to support Roe v. Wade. On questions of contraception and sexuality, Women have simply ignored the authority of the institutional church, the front, entirely. And perhaps that is the message to send to Francis. No matter how lofty his vision and rhetoric, his human resources are diminishing, and he risks the greater danger that even the most devout are no longer listening. Catholics are getting used to doing without priests, and without nuns, and maybe even without a Pontifex Maximus. This has become apparent to me in recent years as I have repeatedly walked the Camino de Santiago with my beloved Fordham students. The ancient pilgrimage route has surged in popularity recently among women, who now make up over half the pilgrims. And even in this most Catholic of practices conducted in this most Catholic of countries, the religious experiences have ranged far beyond the official boundaries of the church. Most pilgrims don't seem to mind. For Catholics along the route, sacramental devotions are less prominent than more informal prayer opportunities. The masses are few, the church is locked, the clergy often nowhere to be found. For my students, the most meaningful Catholic liturgical experience along their 300 kilometers took place in León, at Compline, and it was led by a nun. Thank you.
So we're going to invite Gina to the table, podium.
Good morning. Thank you to Deb for that wonderful introduction and to David for that very important history. It truly is an honor to be here today, and I'm so grateful to be among such a wonderful group and be part of such an important event. I'd like to start off by saying that I think we are living in what is the most progressive time in the Catholic Church, at least in my lifetime. And I stress my lifetime because I'm often called on not acknowledging Vatican II. But since I was not here for Vatican II, I will focus on what I know and what I've experienced as a Catholic feminist. So when I say this is the most progressive time, I'm referring to the time span beginning with the stepping down of Pope Benedict XVI through today. With Benedict making such a bold move, intentionally or not, he has acknowledged that change is possible within the Vatican and within all patriarchal structures. The election of Pope Francis has brought a hope to Catholics that I have not seen before, and a hope to me as a Catholic that I have not experienced before. The moment he walked out onto the Vatican balcony, it was clear that he would be a new kind of pope, one who recognizes the full humanity of every person and who honors the role we all play in the ministry of Jesus. It was the very next day after his election that I received an email from Pope Francis himself. He said he was familiar with my work focusing on women in the Catholic Church, and that he wanted to tap into my ideas and have a real conversation on how we can make positive change in the lives of women. Of course, I immediately started to write down my ideas and develop a plan to address with him. And then my alarm clock went off. True story. So, since I did not get to share those ideas with Pope Francis, I am grateful that I can share them with you here today. Now, let me say, Francis's commitment to the disenfranchised is clear. People around the world continue to be mesmerized by his acts of kindness and mercy, his dedication to social justice for the poor, simplistic living, his welcoming message to persons of all faiths, and his proclamation, "Who am I to judge?" is refreshing to say the least. When it comes to women, Francis has made some very important statements and has acknowledged that it is time to re-examine the roles of women in the church. He has stated that we need a new theology of women and that we must examine women's roles and ensure that we feel like full participants in the church rather than just guests. However, for all of his positive comments, the Pope often speaks in generalities and continues to reveal a highly patriarchal view of the value and traditional role of women. The idea that women's roles exist in the home has been repeatedly reinforced by Francis, who continues to use the doctrinal term complementarity and insists that such a role is an anthropological fact. According to Francis, quote, "The consecrated woman is a mother, must be a mother, and not an old maid," end quote. And, quote, "The fact is, woman was taken from a rib," end quote. These statements are problematic and reinforce the idea that women and men have different roles, with men outranking women. They discount women's actions outside the home, and such an idea ignores women who are not called to motherhood or who are barren, so to speak. Are these women's lives less important? Do their acts of living out ministry in their daily lives count less? Of course not. Yet this theology that Francis upholds perpetrates women being pinned to the underside of dualism. Likewise, it is interesting that Pope Francis does not acknowledge the role motherhood plays in leading to poverty for women. Lack of education and healthcare and adhering to the idea of complementarity leave women in a position to suffer in poverty more than any other group. Because of their traditional roles and the patriarchal structure of family dictated by the church, women learn to put themselves last in every situation, including basic care and rights. If the Pope is to address the needs of those living in poverty, he must address reproductive health and wellness. Data well demonstrates that 2/3 of low-wage jobs are held by women. In addition, women are more likely to head single-parent households. Family structure and poverty are deeply intertwined, with nearly 40% of single mothers being impoverished. Women disproportionately cover the cost of contraception, spending approximately 70% more than men each year. Lack of health care and high costs of contraception contribute to a lack of reproductive health services for women. As a result, women living below the poverty line are 5 times more likely to experience an unintended pregnancy, which leads to significant consequences for childbearing outcomes. While Pope Francis has called for women to have greater decision-making powers in the church, he has made clear that the door to priesthood is closed for women. Likewise, he has made statements that are contradictory to such an objective. Quote, "It is necessary to broaden the opportunities for a stronger presence of women in the church. I am wary of a solution that can be reduced to a kind of female machismo, or masculinity in a skirt, because a woman has a different makeup than a man. But what I hear about the role of woman is often inspired by an ideology of machismo," end quote. Furthermore, calling women the strawberries on the cake is demeaning and refuses to acknowledge the gifts women bring to the church and the larger global community. I, for one, have to say that I particularly winced at this comment, strawberries on the cake, not what I want to be referred to as. Instead, it highlights the prevailing idea that men are valued for their individuality, whereas women are thought of as adding a feminine touch. Such a statement tokenizes women, and it's unacceptable. Although Pope Francis did bring an end to the doctrinal assessment of the LCWR, he keeps Catholic U.S. nuns firmly under the control of the Church's male leadership by refusing to challenge the status quo on matters of sex and gender. And while pushing back against the patriarchy and injustice can certainly have an impact, it does not change the fundamental power equation. In February 2015, the Vatican held the 4-day conference titled Women's Cultures, Equality, and Difference. Not surprisingly, there were no women at the table. Although women were asked to submit 1-minute videos stating what it is like to be a woman. Now, this process well demonstrates the lack of grace the Vatican has when it comes to anything to do with women. Nonetheless, I do want to acknowledge that it was one of the few times that there was an attempt to include women in the conversation, even though it was done in a very clumsy way. So, where the Pope is truly committed to addressing the damage caused by global capitalism, he is not yet modeling to the world how to preside over an organization or institution that does not subjugate women. There is no doubt that Pope Francis is making advancements for the Church. He has humanized the papacy, brought widespread attention to the exploitive economic system, and has welcomed back many to a position of faith. However, Francis is yet to acknowledge the exploitive patriarchal system that exists within the Vatican, causing the ongoing marginalization of women. Nor does he recognize the direct connection between poverty and the oppression of women. Nonetheless, I believe that Pope Francis is building a bridge to the future and is slowly taking steps to create an opportunity for women's rights to be acknowledged by the Vatican. I believe in a feminist ethic of risk, one that demands that we remain optimistic and continue to work towards positive change. As we all know, change does not happen overnight. It takes time. It takes all of our efforts, regardless of the frustration that we feel. And so it is meetings and conversations like these that are so critical to keeping the momentum going, and that will be part of helping to build Francis's bridge. And with any hope, our beloved Francis will hear our call to re-examine his blind spots and take a stronger approach to shifting understandings of gender and women's roles in the Church and the greater community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, David. So it's question time, folks. And I understand there's a microphone back there, so if you have a question, and Ryan, you'll be walking around with a microphone as well. So please raise your hand if you have a question for our esteemed panelists. I know that I want to start with something right away because okay, sure. Sure. So Gina, I want to direct this to you because one of the things that I think, one of the areas where there's not a really clear connection still is what is the connection between working for the greater roles for women in the church, in church leadership, inside the church, real equality, and what's happening with women in impoverished worlds, women who are facing poverty, violence, and so forth. And I would just like you to talk a little bit more about this. I heard Tina Beatty say something very important at one point, and she said, if you don't get the connection, she said, look at the rate of maternal mortality in the world. And she said, and you will be hard-pressed to find anything about that in any Catholic social teaching anywhere, any document, any glowing encyclical about poverty. And so women are invisible in these things. But I would like to hear what you have to say a little bit while other people are getting up to ask their questions.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. This is a really, really important issue. First of all, without having female leadership in the church, a particular experience is missing. It is difficult for a male who certainly does not have a family, who has not experienced parenthood, to understand what it's like to be a parent. But to be a mother, is something very specific that needs to be addressed. Going through pregnancy, needing to have particular nutrition and other things to have a safe pregnancy, to be able to give birth and to be able to nurse a child and care for a child and not have a child being raised in poverty. These are very, very serious issues. And so when we talk about reproductive justice in the church, there's so many different things to be addressed. We need to acknowledge the various experiences of women globally. Certainly there are women who are dealing with very serious poverty issues in the United States, but also around the world, we are seeing women living in particular conditions where they are being forced into, I want to be careful with the word forced, but where women are having multiple children because they do not have access to reproductive health, they do not have access to contraception, and what they end up having are multiple children who they cannot feed, who are starving. And is there anything worse in the world for a mother to experience than watching her own children to starve? Really. And these are very serious issues we're dealing with. Now, without having female leadership in the church, I think that we're missing an entire perspective around what it means to be a woman, what it means to live out the role of being a mother, and carry out this role that the church is demanding through this idea of complementarity. And we're missing the larger issues that exist and how these do directly tie to poverty, these greater issues that Pope Francis is very focused on, but he's not necessarily recognizing how this demand for the role of motherhood is playing into the very issues that he is standing up against. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Do we have any questions out there?
Thank you to both of you for your excellent words. David, I had a question based on sort of you were conjecturing, maybe looking forward a couple generations into the future, that this central authority, the priests and the nuns, and these roles in the priest or in the church, that Americans and Catholics around the world are sort of just getting used to not having them as a part of our lives, not having them in our ear, not having them in our schools. So what replaces it? What's that? Oh, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio with Future Church.
He's a plant. No, just kidding.
Well, that's a really good question, and I can't speculate. The institutional church will stay around, and I think people will stay somewhat linked to it. I think people will feel, for example, for baptisms, marriages, maybe, that this once-in-a-lifetime moment is significant, and that may be the only places where there are priests available. But I think we have to look at two things, and that is that the decline of the priesthood is ongoing, and it's not going to go away. And I think it's by, when is it that
2019.
that over half the diocesan clergy in the United States will be of retirement age, and whatever the uptick in vocations is, that's it's never going to make up for that. So what will be happening in the future is, I think, inevitable. And what there may be are links on the outside to significant life events. But the everyday life of religious or of Christians, Catholics in America will, I think, to the extent that they remain devout, and not go to other churches, will reside in parishes or in smaller, more informal groups that are, by definition, more egalitarian and probably led by women. So you would be looking at this wide linkage. The problem with that for the church is money. That's just going to be an issue. The church depends on a lot on property. It is no longer the largest property owner in the city of New York anymore. The church depends on finances and money to run. And a lot of that money comes from collection baskets, or at least traditionally came from collection baskets. If you're not having masses, if you're not having 6 masses on a Sunday, right? In a large parish where everybody's showing up, you are having 6 collections not taking place. If you have people who are not actively involved in the parish, you have people who are not filling out. Do people still fill out their envelopes for the year pledge? Mm-hmm. You are people who have people who are not doing that. They want you to go online and do it.
Modern age.
The church online, that's a scary notion just in the beginning and from the beginning. But what you're going to look at then is inevitably the problem of resources. And in that situation, I think the church itself will have to change. But I think what we are looking at, is this much looser clerical control over church and a much more informal vision. My students don't, I can't say that, but my students are not as interested in the Mass as they are in being with other Catholic students and taking part in devotions frequently led by one another. And I think that is a reality that will continue. So it's going to be a much looser connection, but it's going to be much harder for the institutional church to function.
So I'm Barbara Batista, Sister of Providence from Terre Haute, Indiana. My question is really addressed to you, Gina. I was intrigued by the mention you made of Francis as building a bridge, but we're also part of that bridge. And recently, a sister in my community negotiated a contract with a local Catholic school, and she was asked if she was participating in women's church, and if so, she had to stop participating in women's church in order to teach at this Catholic school. So some of my friends were like really upset by that, and for me, I see it as a great sign. It's kind of like the circling of the wagons, like they're so nervous about women's church and about the ways in which we gather and support and be an inclusive church. So it's kind of a both and I just would like to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your question, and it's wonderful to meet you. This is an ongoing issue. I mean, we see this across the board, and I think many of us who teach in Catholic colleges often feel that we need to be very strategic in the way that we talk about these kinds of issues. I often talk about the fact that, I think Mormons and Catholics have a lot in common. Mm-hmm. We recently saw the excommunication of Kate Kelly, mm-hmm. and the Mormon Church and a Catholic church. Those are the churches who do those kinds of things. And it's a way to keep control, right? It's a way to keep people from having these types of conversations and pushing for change. What better way to do that than to say, if you keep this up, we're going to kick you out. And so it's disappointing, for sure, but also a sign that, these kinds of things are making an impact, which I think is really positive. And so holding on to that and continuing the work, I think, is very important. And I think that we each pursue that in our own ways, and we each need to find ways to be strategic in our own lives to protect ourselves and to do the work the most appropriately that we can. And I think that's what everybody is doing here, right? We're all finding a way to continue on those conversations. So there's no doubt that those kinds of things will continue on. And then we just have to find the best way for ourselves to work against that.
Could I also add to that very quickly? Sure. One of the issues here, and this is exactly correct, one of the issues here goes back to the question of direct control. For religious women, for women religious, obviously there is the issue of who's the boss, who's the employer, right? And so the question of employment under these circumstances becomes problematic because it becomes a problem back in the community. But if you're not a woman religious, what's the power? What's the authority? This is in America. You can go down the street, even to another Catholic church, frankly, or you can go to your local atheistic university, Catholic university, and you can be part of the community there. You can still get the sacraments. And I think this is a fact of Roman Catholicism institutionally and its bones. It does not still understand what a voluntary association is. It's still a monarchy. It's still a hierarchy. It has not performed wonderfully well in places where it is not officially linked to a government with coercive authority. I think that's something that we need to exploit in the United States, personally.
Excellent.
This is more of a comment, but if you want to further, comment on it, but it's following up on what Dr. Myers said about
David.
David, sorry, about the parishes, the loss of control, frankly. And I'm part of a Eucharistic community, and there are hundreds of these intentional Eucharistic communities in the United States. And we had a big conference, I think it was about the fourth one, national conference, several weeks ago in St. Paul. And I see the breakdown of parishes happening, and what people are doing is not sacrificing their faith or commitment to sacrament, but coming together as Catholics and worshiping as Catholics, and not utilizing ordained male priests, but having lay people celebrate the Eucharist, because we are putting into use our baptism of the priesthood. And that's what baptism is about, that we are all priests. And I'd like you to comment further, because I think this kind of community is not a community of control. It's a community of intentional people together because they have the same faith and want to worship together. So,
I could comment on that, I think, at length, but thank you. I think that's actually quite a beautiful thing to be doing. Even within a world in which the priests are still doing the consecrating, of course, you can have large numbers, you can have the Eucharist everywhere. My mother is in an assisted living home in El Paso, Texas, and for her, the two important things in her week are the rosary, of course, and she occasionally has a chance to take the Eucharist, but it's not a Eucharist, no one is celebrating Mass there, right? The Eucharist is sort of traveling import. And that, I think, is an important thing in terms of the official church, and then let's call it the center and the periphery, just loosely. The church, of course, would say theologically that this is not technically the Eucharist. It's not the sacrifice of Mass, which is still the unbloody representation of Christ's own sacrifice. That's one theology, I know. And yet, and Deborah and I were talking about this on the bus coming over, that in a world in which the power resides in the object of belief, that is to say, the priest has the power to do this, and we argue objectively that the priest has the power to do this, then the significance of lay consecration is minimal. But we don't live in that world. People do not respond that way. People's sense of belief, faith, and power is more subjective and more internal. It's not defined experientially by the doctrine. And so in that case, in your community, whatever the church says, the community feels the presence of the Eucharist. And if the community feels the presence of the Eucharist, who the heck are the priests? Sorry, my students all know that I have a bad mouth. Who the heck is the priest, and who the heck is the church to say that that is not meaningful? And that's my comment on it.
Great. I think we have time for one more question in this session, so fire away.
Good morning. My name is Rhonda Miska. I'm with Call to Action, and I'm a contributor to the Catholic Women Speak books. And thank you, Deb, for mentioning that. So my question, lots of interesting comments that you all shared, but my question is for Gina. You mentioned the blind spot for Pope Francis with the issues of reproductive justice and women's health vis-a-vis poverty, and his very strong prophetic statements around poverty and human dignity in the two-thirds world. And I'm thinking with Laudato Si, where he's now spoken so powerfully about his commitment to creation and the integrity of creation, and thinking about the connections which have been elucidated by ecofeminists about the relationship between degradation of the natural world and a disregard for women and violence against women. Do you see that as another possible blind spot for Francis? And if so, can you speak about how those threads might be woven together?
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. This is certainly, I think, very fair to call this a blind spot. We hear a lot of conflicting statements from Francis. I recently read that he, gave a speech in the Philippines where he talked about family structure not depending on people acting like rabbits, was his quote. But then, a few days later, he was talking somewhere else saying that it was the responsibility of, a family to have many children. And to think about his commitment, and as he's been, having conversations around care for the planet, certainly these connections are not coming together for him, and seeing how problematic it can be to have, to produce unresponsibly, right? Where we're having lots of children if we do not have the natural resources to support that, and how we need to have conversations, if people want to make the choice to limit their family size, how that can be a very positive thing for our community, for the global community, for our planet. So these are certainly critical issues that tie together. And again, I think what we see with Pope Francis is that he sees these issues and he wants to address them, but doesn't necessarily understand how they tie together and how they should be addressed as one. So I think you're absolutely correct.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up. I want to just say thank you to Gina and David. You have been marvelous. You've given us a lot to think about, and as we're all thinking about the future, should our daughters, granddaughters, should the next generation stay? And if they do, can we shape the church in a way that brings a just church forward, and a church where women are truly equals as partners in the making of the church? So thank you very much, and we so glad you were here.
Thank you all to the great panel. We're going to take a break for 15 minutes, at which point the refreshments are still available to you. We're hoping that you'll be punctual and come back at 10:30 so that we can continue on with our panels. Thank you.
The church is never scared of turning down. Never, ever.